Get your hands where I can see them, thug." The words sliced through the humid summer evening air like a blade specifically designed to wound, dripping with contempt and assumption, and the kind of casual racism that had been perfected over generations of policing that treated black bodies as threats to be controlled rather than citizens to be protected. Officer Ryan Caldwell's voice carried across the quiet residential street with aggressive authority, his hand already resting on his service weapon, in a gesture meant to intimidate as much as to demonstrate readiness for violence that he clearly expected would be necessary when dealing with someone who looked like the young man he'd just pulled over. 17-year-old James Morrison sat frozen behind the wheel of his mother's Honda Civic, both hands gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, his heart pounding so hard he could hear the blood rushing in his ears, his mind racing through the protocol his parents had drilled into him since he was old enough to understand that his skin color made routine traffic stops potentially deadly encounters that required perfect compliance and absolute control of every word and gesture and facial expression. He'd been driving home from debate team practice at exactly 28 miles per hour in a 30 zone, signaling every turn, obeying every traffic law with the hypervigilance that black teenagers learned early was necessary for survival, and still he'd been pulled over for reasons that Officer Caldwell hadn't bothered to explain before immediately treating him like a criminal caught in the act of something terrible. "Sir, may I ask why you pulled me over?" James managed to say, his voice steady despite the terror coursing through his 17-year-old body that understood intellectually that he'd done nothing wrong but understood viscerally that innocence offered no protection when officers had already decided you were guilty of existing while black in a neighborhood where someone like you supposedly didn't belong. His debate team training kicked in automatically, clear enunciation, respectful tone, non-threatening posture, though he knew that all the eloquence and respectfulness in the world couldn't overcome assumptions that Officer Caldwell had made in the 3 seconds it took him to register James's skin color and decide that this traffic stop required aggressive dominance rather than professional courtesy. "I said hands where I can see them, and don't you dare reach for anything without announcing exactly what you're doing," Caldwell barked, his flashlight beam sweeping across James's face in a way that felt deliberately aggressive, the brightness forcing James to squint and making it impossible to maintain the eye contact that might have conveyed respect and cooperation and all the things that supposedly mattered in these encounters, but that never seemed sufficient when officers had already written the script in which young black men were always dangerous and always guilty of something, even if the specific crime remained to be determined. James slowly raised both hands from the steering wheel, holding them up near his face with fingers spread wide in the universal gesture of surrender that felt humiliating and enraging in equal measure because he'd committed no crime beyond driving his mother's car through a neighborhood where apparently his presence alone constituted suspicious activity worthy of being treated like a violent felon. "My license and registration are in the glove compartment," James said carefully, announcing every word before moving a single muscle, because he'd heard too many stories and watched too many videos of traffic stops that escalated to violence in the space between a young black man reaching for documents and an officer interpreting that reach as threat requiring lethal response. "I'm going to reach for them now with my right hand, moving very slowly, keeping my left hand visible at all times. My movements will be deliberate, and I will narrate everything I'm doing before I do it. Is that acceptable to you, officer?" The formality of his language was deliberate, deploying his private school education and debate team vocabulary as armor that might protect him from assumptions about who he was and what he represented. Though some part of him already understood that eloquence would likely be interpreted as arrogance or insubordination, rather than recognized as the desperation of a terrified teenager trying to survive an encounter that felt designed to escalate, regardless of his perfect compliance. "What are you, some kind of smartass?" Caldwell sneered, his contempt for James's careful speech evident in the way he practically spat the words. "You think using fancy vocabulary makes you better than me? Makes you something other than just another punk kid who probably stole this car and is trying to talk his way out of getting arrested for it? I know your type. Think you're special because you can string together a sentence. Think you're different from the other thugs in your neighborhood. But you're all the same when it comes down to it. Criminal minds wrapped in whatever costume you think will help you blend in with decent people. The racial subtext wasn't even subtext anymore. It was explicit, undeniable, the kind of naked racism that should have been career-ending, but that too often got explained away as reasonable officer safety concerns or justified suspicion based on high crime area statistics that somehow always translated into treating every black person as inherently criminal, regardless of their actual behavior or their obvious innocence. James felt tears burning behind his eyes. Not just fear anymore, but rage and humiliation, and the soul-crushing exhaustion of being 17 years old and having to defend your basic humanity to someone with a badge and a gun who'd already decided you were worthless trash deserving of contempt and violence. "Officer Caldwell, I haven't stolen this car," James said, fighting to keep his voice level despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. "This is my mother's vehicle. My name is James Morrison. I'm a senior at Riverside Academy. I'm on my way home from debate team practice where I was preparing for the state championships next month. I have my license, my registration, my insurance information, and my school ID all available to verify exactly who I am, and that I have every legal right to be driving this vehicle in this neighborhood or any other neighborhood. I would appreciate if you would allow me to provide those documents so we can resolve whatever concern prompted you to pull me over, because I'm confident that once you verify my information, you'll see that I've committed no violation and that this stop was based on assumptions rather than evidence of any actual wrongdoing." His statement was perfectly constructed, factual, respectful, assertive without being aggressive. Everything his parents and his teachers and his debate coach had taught him about how to navigate encounters with authority while maintaining dignity and advocating for your rights. But he could see in Officer Caldwell's expression that none of it mattered, that every word he spoke was being interpreted not as evidence of his education and his innocence, but as confirmation that he was exactly the kind of uppity black kid who needed to be put in his place, and reminded that all his achievements and his articulate speech and his private school education meant nothing when a white officer had decided he was a threat. A sleek black SUV with tinted windows pulled up behind Officer Caldwell's patrol car, its presence initially unnoticed by Caldwell, who was too focused on his aggressive interrogation of James to register that someone was observing this encounter with growing concern and mounting anger. The SUV's door opened, and a middle-aged black man in an expensive suit emerged, his expression transforming from curiosity about why a police car had someone pulled over on his residential street to immediate recognition and horror as he saw James Morrison, his godson, the brilliant debate champion he'd known since birth, the young man he'd personally mentored and guided through college application processes and scholarship competitions. Being treated like a criminal by an officer whose body, language, and verbal contempt made clear that this was no routine traffic stop, but an exercise in racial humiliation and dominance. "James!" the man called out, his voice carrying authority that made Officer Caldwell finally turn around to see who was interrupting his demonstration of power over a teenager he'd decided deserved to be degraded and frightened, and reminded of his place in a society that still treated blackness as inherently suspicious, regardless of actual behavior or obvious innocence. Officer Ryan Caldwell felt irritation surge at this interruption from someone who had no business interfering with his traffic stop. But before he could order the man back into his vehicle and away from police business, he registered the face of someone he recognized from news coverage and official city events and public ceremonies where cameras flashed and hands were shaken and speeches were delivered about community partnership and public safety priorities. His blood ran cold as recognition fully dawned. This wasn't just some concerned citizen or protective father figure stepping in to question his treatment of a black teenager. This was Marcus Jefferson, senior policy advisor to Mayor Catherine Williams, the man whose recommendations shaped city budget allocations for police funding, whose analysis informed mayoral decisions about police leadership and departmental priorities. whose quiet influence extended through every level of city government in ways that made him simultaneously invisible to most citizens and absolutely critical to anyone who understood how power actually operated behind the formal structures of elected officials and public-facing administrators. And standing beside the SUV now, her own expression shifting from professional neutrality to barely controlled fury as she absorbed the scene playing out before her, was Mayor Catherine Williams herself, watching one of her police officers call her senior policy advisor's godson a thug and treat him with the kind of casual brutality that she'd spent 3 years trying to reform through policies and training and budget incentives that were apparently failing spectacularly if this was how officers conducted themselves when they thought no one important was watching. "Officer Caldwell," Marcus Jefferson said, his voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that was somehow more terrifying than yelling could ever be. "Would you mind explaining to me why you're treating my godson James Morrison like a criminal suspect when he's committed no traffic violation, broken no law, and has been attempting to comply with your increasingly aggressive and disrespectful demands while maintaining a level of composure and dignity that frankly exceeds what should be required of any citizen during a routine traffic stop?" The question hung in the humid evening air like an indictment, and Caldwell felt the ground shifting beneath his feet as he began to understand that his assumptions about this traffic stop, about who James was, about who would care what happened to him, about whether there would be consequences for treating him with contempt and aggression, had been catastrophically wrong in ways that would likely end his law enforcement career and potentially criminal prosecution, depending on exactly what got captured on his body camera that he'd conveniently forgotten to activate before initiating this stop because he'd learned that cameras complicated narratives when you wanted to teach young black men lessons about respect and compliance through fear and humiliation rather than through professional conduct and actual law enforcement. Think about a time when someone in authority treated you like you were guilty of something before you'd even spoken. Did anyone step in to defend you? Or were you left trying to prove your innocence alone? Drop your story below. Sometimes just naming these experiences helps us process the powerlessness and rage they create, and reminds us we're not crazy for feeling violated by what others dismiss as just doing their job. Officer Ryan Caldwell stood frozen in the beam of the SUV's headlights, his confident aggression evaporating as recognition settled over him with the weight of inevitable professional destruction, and he watched Marcus Jefferson approach with the measured control of someone who'd spent decades learning to channel righteous fury into calculated advocacy that achieved justice through systems, rather than through the immediate violence that Caldwell's behavior richly deserved. Mayor Catherine Williams remained by the SUV for a moment, her phone already out and recording the encounter with the kind of documentation discipline that came from years of understanding that accountability required evidence and that claims of police misconduct got dismissed without video proof that made denial impossible, even for departments and unions committed to protecting officers regardless of their actions. James remained in the driver's seat with his hands still raised and visible, tears now streaming openly down his face as the adrenaline that had kept him controlled and articulate during Caldwell's aggressive interrogation began to metabolize into the kind of shaking terror that came after crisis when your body finally understood it had survived something that could have ended very differently if the wrong person had arrived instead of the right ones. If timing had been slightly different, if circumstances had aligned in ways that left him just another hashtag and another grieving family and another community demanding justice that would likely never come. "Mr. Jefferson, I didn't realize this young man I was just conducting a routine traffic stop based on—" Caldwell stammered, his earlier confidence completely shattered, as he struggled to construct an explanation that could possibly justify what Marcus and the mayor had just witnessed. What his own words captured on their recordings had made undeniable even to sympathetic audiences who might otherwise give him benefit of doubt about reasonable officer safety concerns and justifiable suspicion based on high-crime area demographics. Officer Caldwell, I want you to stop talking immediately because everything you say right now is being recorded and will absolutely be used in the disciplinary proceedings and potential criminal prosecution that you're facing based on what I just observed, Marcus interrupted, his voice still controlled but carrying unmistakable authority that came from decades of working within systems and understanding exactly how to build cases that survived legal challenges and union defenses. You called a 17-year-old boy a thug before you'd asked him a single question about why you'd pulled him over. You treated him with open contempt and racial hostility from the moment you approached his vehicle. You accused him of stealing his own mother's car based solely on your assumptions about who he was and what he represented based on his skin color. And you did all of this while he was attempting to comply with your demands, while he was speaking to you with more respect than you deserved, while he was doing everything that officers claim citizens should do to avoid escalation and violence during traffic stops. Mayor Williams had approached now and was standing beside Marcus, her presence transforming this from a confrontation between a police advisor and a patrol officer into something far more significant. The city's highest elected official personally witnessing and documenting police misconduct that represented exactly the kind of racist policing she'd campaigned against and promised to reform through comprehensive policy changes and accountability systems that were apparently insufficient to prevent officers like Caldwell from treating black teenagers like criminals deserving of humiliation and aggression. Officer Caldwell, I'm Mayor Catherine Williams, and I need you to understand the gravity of what's happening here, she said, her voice carrying the weight of both official authority and personal fury at watching someone abuse power she'd helped grant through city budget allocations and policy decisions that were supposed to fund professional law enforcement rather than racist intimidation of innocent citizens. You have just been recorded calling the godson of my senior policy advisor a thug, treating him with visible contempt and racial hostility, and conducting what appears to be a pretextual stop based entirely on your assumptions about who belongs in this neighborhood and who should be viewed with immediate suspicion. That recording will be made public. It will be shared with every media outlet in this city, and it will become the centerpiece of the comprehensive review of your conduct and of the department's training and accountability systems that have apparently failed to prevent exactly the kind of racist policing that destroys community trust and endangers lives. James finally lowered his hands, his body shaking uncontrollably now as the terror and humiliation and rage that he'd been suppressing through perfect compliance finally broke through his carefully maintained composure. And Marcus immediately went to the driver's side door and knelt down so he could look his godson in the eye and offer whatever comfort and support could be provided in a moment when words felt painfully inadequate to address the trauma of what James had just experienced. James, breathe with me. In through your nose, hold for 4 counts, out through your mouth. You're safe now. You did everything right. Everything. The way you handled yourself just now, the way you maintained your composure and your dignity while being treated with that kind of disrespect and hostility, that took more courage and maturity than most adults could manage. I'm so proud of you, and I'm so sorry that you had to experience this, that being articulate and educated and compliant wasn't sufficient protection against an officer who'd already decided what you were before you'd spoken a single word. This shouldn't have happened. You shouldn't have had to be perfect just to survive a routine traffic stop, and we're going to make sure there are real consequences for Officer Caldwell's conduct and real changes to prevent other young people from experiencing what you just went through. Officer Caldwell had retreated to his patrol car and was now speaking urgently into his radio, calling for a supervisor with the kind of desperate edge that suggested he understood his career was over, but was hoping that immediate damage control might somehow salvage something from the wreckage of his catastrophic misjudgment. Mayor Williams continued recording everything. Caldwell's nervous radio traffic, James's visible trauma in the driver's seat, Marcus's attempts to comfort and support his godson, the entire scene that would become public record and would force conversations about police conduct that the department had been avoiding through carefully managed public relations and strategic silence about patterns of racist policing that victimized black citizens daily but rarely generated the kind of political consequences that might actually motivate institutional change. Within minutes, 2 additional patrol cars arrived along with a police supervisor, Sergeant Michael Torres, who emerged from his vehicle and immediately recognized the mayor standing on the residential street recording a traffic stop that had apparently gone very wrong in ways that were going to create significant political and professional fallout for everyone involved. "Mayor Williams, Mr. Jefferson, I'm Sergeant Torres, and I'm the overnight watch commander," he said, his expression already reflecting the sinking realization that whatever had happened here was serious enough to bring the city's top elected official and her most influential advisor to a routine traffic stop scene. "Can someone brief me on the situation so I can figure out how to proceed appropriately?" Marcus stood, placing a protective hand on James's shoulder through the open car window, before turning to address the supervisor with the kind of controlled fury that came from decades of being forced to educate white authority figures about racism they should have recognized themselves. "Sergeant Torres, your officer Ryan Caldwell conducted a pretextual stop of my 17-year-old godson James Morrison, called him a thug before asking a single question about why he'd initiated the stop, treated him with visible racial contempt and hostility, accused him of stealing his own mother's car based solely on assumptions about his race, and created a situation where a teenager who'd committed no violation was terrorized and traumatized simply for existing as a young black man in a neighborhood where Officer Caldwell apparently decided he didn't belong. All of this has been recorded on multiple devices and will be made public, and all of this represents exactly the kind of racist policing that Mayor Williams has been trying to address through reforms that clearly haven't penetrated to officers who feel comfortable calling teenagers thugs and treating them like criminals based entirely on their skin color." Sergeant Torres's face had gone pale as Marcus described what had occurred, and he turned to look at Officer Caldwell with an expression mixing anger and disappointment, and the weary recognition of someone who'd seen too many officers destroy their careers through racist conduct that they somehow believed would remain consequence-free as long as they could construct post hoc rationalizations about reasonable suspicion and officer safety concerns. "Officer Caldwell, I need you to return to the station immediately and wait in the watch commander's office until I can return to conduct a preliminary interview about this incident," Torres said, his voice carrying the kind of controlled professionalism that barely concealed his fury at having to manage yet another racist policing incident that would generate media scrutiny and community outrage and political pressure for accountability that the department would resist through union protections and qualified immunity doctrines that made it nearly impossible to discipline officers even when their misconduct was documented clearly and undeniably. "Sergeant Torres, I don't want Officer Caldwell driving anywhere or speaking with anyone until we've secured his body camera footage and his patrol car dash cam footage," Mayor Williams interjected, her experience with police accountability battles informing her immediate concern that evidence might disappear or be corrupted if officers were given time to coordinate stories and sanitize records. "I want that footage preserved immediately. I want it copied to multiple secure locations, and I want independent verification that it hasn't been tampered with or edited in any way. This incident will be investigated thoroughly and transparently, and we're not going to allow any possibility for evidence to go missing or for narratives to be constructed that contradict what Mr. Jefferson and I personally witnessed." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife as Sergeant Torres processed the reality that the mayor was personally involved in this traffic stop and was demanding accountability in ways that couldn't be deflected through normal channels of internal investigation and union protection that typically shielded officers from meaningful consequences, even when their conduct clearly violated policies and constitutional rights. "Mayor Williams, I understand your concerns, and I assure you that we'll handle this investigation with complete integrity and transparency, Torres said, though the careful phrasing revealed his awareness that the department's track record on accountability didn't inspire confidence in those promises. Officer Caldwell, give me your body camera right now along with your patrol car keys so we can secure the dash cam footage. You're suspended immediately pending investigation, and you need to understand that you're potentially facing not just departmental discipline but criminal charges depending on what the investigation reveals about your conduct and your motivations for initiating this stop and for treating this young man with such obvious racial hostility. Caldwell looked like he might argue or defend himself, but the presence of the mayor and Marcus Jefferson apparently convinced him that silence was his only viable strategy at this point, and he surrendered his camera and keys without protest before being escorted to a different patrol car that would transport him back to the station while the scene was processed and documented. James had finally stopped shaking enough to speak, and he looked up at Marcus with eyes that carried a mixture of gratitude and devastation that came from having your godfather arrive in time to save you, but also having to experience the kind of racist violence that required saving in the first place. Uncle Marcus, I did everything right, James said, his voice breaking on the last word, as the injustice of perfect compliance being insufficient protection finally overwhelmed the composure he'd maintained through sheer force of will during Caldwell's aggressive interrogation. I was polite. I announced every movement. I used my debate team training to speak clearly and respectfully, and none of it mattered because he'd already decided I was a thug before I'd said anything. If you and Mayor Williams hadn't arrived when you did, what would have happened? Would he have arrested me? Would he have searched the car looking for drugs or weapons that don't exist? Would he have escalated to violence if I'd made any movement he interpreted as threatening? I did everything right, and it still almost went wrong. And that means there's nothing I can do to actually protect myself from this happening again. From some other officer deciding I'm dangerous based on how I look rather than what I've done. Marcus felt his heart breaking as he listened to his godson articulate the devastating lesson that every black parent dreads teaching and every black teenager dreads learning, that perfect compliance offers no guarantee of safety, that achievement and education provide no reliable armor against racism, that the rules they'd been taught about how to survive police encounters were necessary but insufficient protection when officers operated from assumptions that treated blackness itself as reasonable suspicion, requiring aggressive response. You're right that you did everything perfectly, and you're right that it shouldn't require perfection just to survive a traffic stop, Marcus told James, his own voice thick with emotion. What happened tonight wasn't your fault, and it wasn't something you could have prevented through different behavior or better choices. Officer Caldwell saw a young black man and immediately decided you were a threat and a criminal, and nothing you said or did could have changed his mind because he wasn't actually responding to your behavior. He was responding to his racist assumptions about what your skin color meant, about who you are and what you represent. That's not on you to fix through perfect compliance. That's on us, me, Mayor Williams, everyone who has power and authority and voice, to fix through accountability and reform that makes it impossible for officers like Caldwell to treat people the way he treated you tonight. Mayor Williams knelt beside Marcus, adding her voice to his in offering whatever comfort and support could be provided in this moment. James, I want you to know that what happened to you tonight is going to matter, she said. Not just in terms of Officer Caldwell facing consequences, though he absolutely will face severe discipline and likely criminal charges, but in terms of forcing changes to how we train officers, how we hold them accountable, how we create systems that make it harder for racism to operate through policing, even when individual officers claim they don't have racist intent. Your experience tonight, as traumatic and unjust as it was, is going to become a catalyst for reforms that protect other young people from experiencing what you went through. That doesn't make it okay that it happened to you, and it doesn't erase the trauma you've experienced. But I want you to know that we're going to make sure your suffering produces meaningful change rather than just being another incident that gets briefly acknowledged and then forgotten once media attention fades. She paused, looking directly into James's eyes. And I want you to know that you have every right to be angry, every right to feel betrayed by a system that's supposed to protect you, but that treated you like a criminal. Every right to question whether anything we do will actually make a difference when racism operates so automatically and so casually that an officer can call you a thug within seconds of pulling you over. Hold on to that anger, channel it into advocacy and activism, use it to demand the changes that my generation has failed to achieve despite decades of promises. We need your voice and your generation's refusal to accept the excuses and the incremental half measures that have allowed racist policing to continue despite all the training and all the policies and all the promises of reform. The scene in the residential street had transformed from a routine traffic stop into an impromptu crisis management situation, with additional supervisors arriving along with a police department public information officer who'd been roused from sleep and summoned to manage what was clearly going to become a major media story given the mayor's personal involvement and her stated intention to make this incident public, rather than handling it through quiet internal channels that typically protected officers from external scrutiny. James had been allowed to exit his vehicle finally, no longer treated as a suspect, but now recognized as a victim whose trauma required immediate attention and whose experience would need to be documented thoroughly for the investigations and legal proceedings that would follow. Marcus had called James's mother, Angela Morrison, who arrived within minutes with the kind of controlled panic that came from receiving a call that your teenage son had been pulled over by police and was safe, but had experienced something traumatic that required your immediate presence and support. Angela's face when she saw James, the tears still wet on his cheeks, the trembling that hadn't fully subsided, the defeated slump of shoulders that usually carried confidence born from academic achievement and debate championship trophies and college acceptance letters. That face reflected every black parent's worst nightmare realized, the moment when all your warnings and all your training and all your prayers prove insufficient to protect your child from a system that treats their blackness as threat, regardless of their actual innocence or obvious humanity. "Baby, are you hurt? Did he touch you? What happened?" Angela's questions tumbled out in rapid succession as she pulled James into a fierce embrace that was as much about reassuring herself that he was physically intact as it was about providing comfort and security after trauma. Marcus stepped back to give them space while briefing Angela on what had occurred, his account making her expression shift from worry to fury and back to worry as she processed both what had happened to her son and what could have happened if circumstances had been slightly different. If Marcus and Mayor Williams hadn't arrived when they did, if Officer Caldwell's aggression had escalated beyond verbal abuse into the kind of physical violence that ended too many traffic stops with black, teenagers injured or dead, and officers claiming they'd feared for their lives despite video evidence suggesting otherwise. That officer called my baby a thug. Angela's voice carried the kind of cold fury that was somehow more frightening than screaming. My straight-A student who's been accepted to Yale with a full scholarship, my debate champion who volunteers at the community center teaching younger kids public speaking skills, my son who's never been in trouble, never committed a crime, never given anyone any reason to view him as anything other than the respectful, brilliant young man he is. That officer took one look at him and decided he was a thug who'd probably stolen this car, and he felt comfortable saying that out loud. Treating James with that kind of contempt, creating a situation where my son was terrified for his life during a routine traffic stop? Mayor Williams approached Angela with the kind of careful respect that acknowledged this mother's fury was entirely justified and deserved space to be expressed without being managed or minimized through political platitudes about isolated incidents or bad apples that didn't reflect systemic patterns. "Mrs. Morrison, I witnessed what Officer Caldwell did to your son, and I'm here not just as mayor but as a mother myself who understands the terror of watching your child be treated like a criminal by someone with power to harm them. I want you to know that Officer Caldwell will face the fullest possible consequences for his conduct, that his actions tonight will trigger a comprehensive review of our training and accountability systems, and that your son's experience is going to become a catalyst for changes that should have happened long ago, but that required this kind of undeniable, documented incident to overcome the resistance and the denials that have protected racist policing for far too long. I know that doesn't undo what James experienced tonight, and I know that promises of reform ring hollow when you're processing the trauma of almost losing your son to police violence. But I'm committed to ensuring that James's suffering produces lasting change rather than just temporary attention that fades once the next crisis captures media focus. Angela absorbed the mayor's words with visible skepticism, born from decades of hearing similar promises after previous incidents that generated temporary outrage but little sustained transformation of police practices and culture. Mayor Williams, with respect, black mothers in this city have been hearing promises about police reform since before James was born. We've sat through community meetings where officials expressed concern and pledged to do better. We've watched videos of our children being brutalized and killed, and we've listened to explanations about officer safety and split-second decisions and how we need to understand the difficult job police have. And then we've watched officers get acquitted or receive minimal discipline or get hired by different departments when one jurisdiction finally fires them for conduct that should have ended their careers years earlier. So forgive me if I'm not particularly moved by promises of reform, when what I actually need is a guarantee that my son can drive home from debate practice without being treated like a criminal by officers who see his skin color and immediately assume he's dangerous. Can you give me that guarantee? Can you promise me that this incident will actually change something fundamental rather than just being another data point in the endless documentation of racist policing that continues regardless of how many promises get made after each new outrage? The question hung in the humid night air like an indictment, and Mayor Williams had the decency not to offer empty reassurances that she couldn't actually deliver. Understanding that Angela Morrison deserved honesty about the limits of what even well-intentioned political leadership could achieve through policy reforms that had to be implemented by officers who often resisted accountability, and through union contracts that protected personnel regardless of their conduct. Mrs. Morrison, I can't guarantee that this will never happen again, because I don't have direct control over every officer's split-second decisions or their unconscious biases that shape how they perceive and respond to black citizens, Williams said with careful honesty. What I can promise is that Officer Caldwell will be fired and potentially prosecuted, that his conduct tonight will be made public in ways that make it impossible for other departments to hire him, that we'll implement mandatory bias training that goes beyond checkbox compliance to actually challenge officers' assumptions, that we'll create accountability systems to track officer behavior patterns and intervene before bias produces the kind of incident we witnessed tonight, and that your son's experience will be centered in every conversation we have about police reform going forward. Those are concrete actions with measurable outcomes, and while they're not sufficient to eliminate all risk, they're real changes that will make incidents like this less likely and ensure consequences when they do occur. Sergeant Torres had been coordinating with arriving investigators to document the scene, preserve evidence, and begin the formal process of internal affairs investigation that would examine Officer Caldwell's conduct and determine appropriate discipline beyond the immediate suspension that had already been imposed. Torres approached the group clustered around James with visible discomfort at having to insert himself into a family's trauma processing, but professional obligation required him to gather preliminary statements while events were still fresh and before attorneys got involved to manage messaging and protect legal interests. Mr. Jefferson, Mayor Williams, Mrs. Morrison, I need to collect official statements from everyone who witnessed this incident so we can build a complete record for the investigation, Torres said. I understand this is traumatic, and you'd probably prefer to go home and process what happened, but documentation is critical while memories are fresh and before details start getting confused or forgotten. James, I especially need to hear from you about exactly what Officer Caldwell said and did from the moment he initiated the stop until Mr. Jefferson and Mayor Williams arrived. I know this is difficult, but your account is the most important piece of evidence we'll have for holding Officer Caldwell accountable. James looked at his mother, seeking permission or guidance about whether to relive the trauma so soon after experiencing it, whether cooperating with an investigation that would be conducted by the same department that employed the officer who'd just terrorized him was wise, or whether it made more sense to lawyer up immediately and protect his rights before providing any statements that might somehow be used against him or twisted to minimize Caldwell's misconduct. Angela nodded her permission while adding her own conditions. "Sergeant Torres, my son will provide a statement tonight because I want Officer Caldwell's conduct documented as thoroughly as possible while everything is fresh. But I'm going to record James's statement on my own device as well, and I want written confirmation that his testimony is being given voluntarily and that he's not being treated as a suspect or as someone who needs to explain or justify his own behavior during this stop. James was the victim of Officer Caldwell's racist aggression, and I won't have him treated as if he contributed to this situation through any action or attitude that somehow prompted or justified the way he was treated." Her conditions were reasonable, but revealed the depth of distrust that existed between black families and police departments that had repeatedly demonstrated they couldn't be trusted to investigate their own misconduct honestly or to prioritize civilian rights over officer protection. James's statement was methodical and heartbreaking, delivered in the same clear, articulate voice he used for debate competitions, but now describing not an abstract policy question, but the lived reality of being treated like a criminal for existing while black in America. He recounted Officer Caldwell's immediate aggression, the thug comment made before any questions about the traffic stop, the accusations of car theft based solely on assumptions about who could legitimately be driving a Honda Civic in this neighborhood, the contemptuous mockery of his careful speech patterns, the escalating hostility that made every second feel like it might be the moment when verbal abuse transformed into physical violence. Marcus and Mayor Williams provided corroborating statements about what they'd observed when they arrived, their accounts documenting Caldwell's visible contempt and the terror evident in James's posture and voice as he tried desperately to comply perfectly enough to survive an encounter that felt designed to escalate regardless of his behavior. The multiple recordings from different angles would make it impossible for Caldwell to construct alternative narratives about reasonable officer conduct or to claim that he'd been responding professionally to suspicious behavior rather than engaging in racial profiling that violated both policy and constitutional requirements for equal treatment under law. By the time statements were completed and James was finally free to leave the scene that had been his prison for over 2 hours, it was nearly midnight, and the residential street had attracted a small crowd of neighbors who'd emerged from their homes to see what was causing the police presence, and who'd stayed to witness the aftermath of an incident that was already being shared on social media and generating outrage among black communities that recognized James's experience as painfully familiar rather than exceptional. Angela drove James home in the Honda Civic that Officer Caldwell had accused him of stealing, Marcus following in his SUV with Mayor Williams, all of them processing in their own ways what had occurred and what it meant for James's sense of safety and for the broader work of police reform that had proven so frustratingly inadequate to prevent exactly this kind of racist encounter that traumatized innocent teenagers and reminded black families that their children's achievements offered no reliable protection against officers who viewed blackness itself as reasonable suspicion requiring aggressive response. James sat silent in the passenger seat, staring out the window at streets he'd driven countless times before, but that now felt different, dangerous, full of potential encounters with police who might see him as threat rather than citizen, who might interpret his careful speech as arrogance requiring correction rather than recognizing it as the desperate eloquence of a scared teenager trying to survive. "Mom, I don't want to drive anymore," James finally said, his voice small and defeated in ways that broke Angela's heart, because she understood he wasn't just talking about tonight or tomorrow, but about fundamental loss of freedom and independence that white teenagers took for granted, but that black teenagers learned could be deadly. "I know that sounds dramatic, but every time I get behind the wheel, now I'm going to be terrified that some officer is going to pull me over and decide I'm a criminal before I've even spoken. I'm going to second-guess every lane change, every turn, every decision about which route to take home, constantly calculating which neighborhoods are safer for someone who looks like me to drive through, which times of day make me more or less likely to get stopped, which clothes make me look less threatening to officers who've already decided I'm dangerous. That's not living. That's surviving. Constantly. Exhausting yourself trying to be perfect enough that maybe you won't get killed during a routine traffic stop. And tonight proved that even perfection isn't enough. That I can do everything right and still end up in handcuffs or worse because Officer Caldwell's assumptions about me mattered more than my actual behavior or my obvious innocence. Angela reached over and squeezed her son's hand, tears streaming down her own face as she absorbed the weight of what racism had stolen from him tonight. Not just his sense of safety, but his faith that achievement and respectability could protect him. His belief that the world was fundamentally fair and that good behavior would be rewarded rather than met with suspicion and contempt. The Morrison home was in an upscale neighborhood that James's parents had specifically chosen because they'd believed, naively they now understood, that living in a good area would provide some protection for their black son, that officers in wealthy neighborhoods would be more professional and less likely to engage in the kind of aggressive profiling that plagued poorer communities. Tonight had shattered that illusion completely, revealing that blackness remained threatening to officers regardless of zip code or property values or the obvious markers of middle-class respectability that white families deployed automatically without ever thinking about them as armor against state violence. James's father, David Morrison, had been away on a business trip and had rushed home after Angela's frantic call, arriving just as they pulled into the driveway with Marcus and Mayor Williams following behind. David's face, when he saw his son, still trembling slightly, eyes red from crying, moving with the careful fragility of someone who'd just survived trauma, that face reflected a father's helpless rage at being unable to protect his child from a system designed to view him as threat regardless of his obvious humanity and innocence. "James, son, come here," David said, pulling his 17-year-old into an embrace that was as much about David's own need for reassurance that his child was alive and intact as it was about providing comfort. Marcus and Mayor Williams gave the family space for their reunion, standing back and allowing the Morrisons this private moment before the inevitable conversations about next steps and legal options and how to process trauma that would require professional help beyond what loving parents could provide despite their best intentions and fierce protectiveness. After several minutes, David turned to Marcus with an expression mixing gratitude and devastation. "Thank you for being there, for arriving when you did, for using your position and your relationship with Mayor Williams to protect James when we couldn't. I don't want to think about what might have happened if you hadn't been driving down that street at exactly that moment, if Officer Caldwell had been allowed to continue escalating his aggression without anyone with power and authority intervening to stop him. We did everything we thought we were supposed to do, taught James to be respectful and compliant, enrolled him in private school to give him advantages and opportunities, moved to a good neighborhood, raised him to believe that achievement and education would protect him. And tonight proved that none of it matters when officers operate from assumptions that his skin color makes him inherently dangerous, regardless of his actual behavior or his obvious status as an accomplished student with a bright future. Marcus understood David's anger and his grief at watching carefully constructed protections prove insufficient, having experienced similar moments throughout his own career when his credentials and his influence failed to shield younger black people from police violence and racist assumptions that operated automatically despite policies and training designed to prevent exactly these kinds of encounters. David, Angela, James did everything perfectly tonight, and it still almost went wrong, which means the problem isn't with him or with how you raised him. The problem is with Officer Caldwell and with a system that produces officers who feel comfortable calling black teenagers thugs and treating them with open contempt because they've learned through experience that racist policing rarely generates real consequences as long as they can construct post hoc justifications about reasonable suspicion. and officer safety. What happened tonight is on Caldwell and on everyone who's been responsible for training and supervising him, not on James or on you as parents who've done everything you could to prepare him for a world that treats blackness as inherently suspicious. We're going to make sure Caldwell faces the fullest possible consequences, and we're going to use James's experience as catalyst for reforms that might prevent other families from going through what you're experiencing right now. That's not adequate compensation for the trauma James suffered, but it's the best we can offer in a system that's proven itself resistant to transformation despite decades of promises and incremental policy changes that never seem sufficient to actually prevent the next incident. Mayor Williams added her own commitment to ensuring accountability and reform, understanding that her presence and her documented witnessing of the incident created political pressure that couldn't be deflected through normal channels of internal investigation that typically protected officers from meaningful consequences. Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, I want you to know that my office will be personally monitoring this investigation and the discipline process to ensure Officer Caldwell faces appropriate consequences that reflect the severity of his misconduct. We'll also be conducting a comprehensive review of our traffic stop data to identify whether Caldwell has a pattern of targeting black drivers, and we'll be examining whether his field training officers and supervisors failed to recognize or address problematic behavior that should have triggered intervention long before tonight. James's experience matters, and it's going to drive changes that should have happened years ago, but that required this kind of undeniable, high-profile incident to overcome institutional resistance to real accountability and transformation. I know that doesn't undo what James experienced, but I hope it provides some measure of justice and some confidence that his suffering won't be in vain. The conversation continued late into the night, with Marcus and Mayor Williams eventually departing to allow the Morrison family privacy to process their trauma and to begin the difficult work of helping James heal from an experience that would shape his relationship with police and with American society for the rest of his life. Before leaving, Marcus pulled James aside for a private conversation that drew on decades of experience mentoring young black men through the specific challenges of navigating a world that viewed them with suspicion regardless of their achievements or their obvious humanity. James, what happened tonight was wrong and traumatic, and it's going to affect you in ways that might not be fully apparent right now when you're still processing the immediate shock and fear. You're going to have moments when you feel angry at Officer Caldwell and at a system that allowed him to treat you that way. You're going to have moments when you feel ashamed or embarrassed, even though you did nothing wrong and have nothing to be ashamed of. You're going to have moments when you doubt yourself and wonder if maybe you could have handled something differently to prevent the escalation, even though intellectually you know that nothing you did or said contributed to Caldwell's racist aggression. All of those feelings are normal responses to trauma, and I want you to know that you don't have to process them alone or pretend you're fine when you're not. He continued, I'm going to connect you with a therapist who specializes in racial trauma and who understands the specific psychological impacts of police violence on young black men. Talking to someone who gets it, who won't minimize what you experienced or suggest you're overreacting. That's going to be crucial for processing this in healthy ways rather than letting it fester and poison your relationship with yourself and with the world. I also want you to know that your anger about what happened is valid and righteous, and channeling that anger into advocacy and activism is one way to transform trauma into purpose, but only if that feels right to you, only if activism serves your healing rather than becoming another burden you carry, because people expect you to turn your pain into a teaching moment for others. You don't owe anyone your trauma or your story beyond what you choose to share. And taking care of yourself has to be the priority, even when people want to use your experience to make broader political points about police reform. You're a person who was hurt, not a symbol or a case study, and your healing matters more than the political utility of your suffering. James absorbed Marcus's words with visible relief at being given permission to prioritize his own well-being over the broader cause of police reform, having already felt the weight of expectation that his experience should serve some higher purpose beyond his own trauma and recovery. Uncle Marcus, everyone keeps saying that what happened to me is going to drive changes and reforms, that Officer Caldwell will face consequences, that my experience matters beyond just what it means for me personally. And I want to believe that. I want my suffering to mean something and to protect other kids from going through what I went through. But I also feel angry that it took this happening to me, that it took the mayor's godson getting racially profiled for there to be real consequences and real attention, when black kids in poor neighborhoods have been experiencing this same treatment for decades without anyone with power caring enough to do anything about it. Why does it take someone with connections, someone whose godfather has the mayor's ear, for racist policing to finally generate accountability? What about all the kids who don't have those protections, whose parents don't know people in positions of authority, whose stories never get heard because they don't have access to platforms that amplify their voices? It feels wrong that my privilege, and I know it's privilege even though I'm black and I experienced racism, I still have educational and economic advantages that most black kids don't have. It feels wrong that my privilege is what finally makes this incident matter, when the same thing has been happening to less privileged kids forever, without generating the kind of attention and outrage that my case is producing. Marcus felt pride mixing with sadness as he listened to his godson articulate analysis that revealed both his debate team training and his moral clarity about structural injustice that extended beyond individual incidents to encompass patterns of whose suffering gets recognized and whose gets ignored. James, you're absolutely right that it's unjust that your case is getting attention that countless other cases of racist policing never receive because the victims don't have your advantages or your connections to people with power and platform. That's part of the same structural racism that produced Officer Caldwell's treatment of you. The system that devalues black lives generally, but makes exceptions for black people with the right credentials or the right connections or the right respectability markers that allow them to be seen as worthy victims rather than dismissed as thugs who probably deserved whatever happened to them. The work of justice requires acknowledging that unfairness, while also using whatever advantages and platform you have to push for changes that benefit everyone, not just people who look like you or who have similar access to resources and influence. Your case is getting attention partly because of who your godfather is, yes, but also because Mayor Williams is committed to police reform and because the evidence is so clear that even people who typically defend police conduct can't deny that what Caldwell did was wrong. We have to use that attention strategically to push for systemic changes rather than just individual accountability, to ensure that the reforms we implement protect all black kids, regardless of whether their godfathers know the mayor. The conversation between Marcus and James continued for another hour, touching on questions of privilege and justice and how to live with the knowledge that protection from some forms of racism came at the cost of recognizing how many others remained vulnerable to violence that wouldn't generate similar outrage or accountability. When Marcus finally left the Morrison home in the early hours of morning, he carried renewed determination to use his position and his influence to push for reforms that would outlast the immediate attention generated by this incident, reforms that would create accountability systems comprehensive enough to protect all black youth rather than just those fortunate enough to have godfathers in positions of power. The work ahead was extensive and would require sustained effort beyond the initial outrage and promises that followed high-profile incidents. But Marcus understood that James's trauma had created a political opening that couldn't be wasted through incrementalism or through accepting cosmetic changes that allowed fundamental problems to persist unchallenged. The morning after James Morrison's traumatic traffic stop, video footage of the incident had spread across every social media platform with the viral velocity that characterized the most egregious examples of police misconduct, amplified not just by local activists, but by national civil rights organizations that recognize the case as perfect illustration of how racist policing operated even against black youth, with every conceivable advantage and protection. The footage from Mayor Williams's phone showed Officer Ryan Caldwell's contemptuous treatment of James with devastating clarity. The immediate thug comment, the accusations of car theft based solely on racist assumptions, the mockery of James's articulate speech patterns, the escalating aggression that made a routine traffic stop feel like a prelude to violence that only Marcus Jefferson's timely arrival had prevented from escalating further. News outlets across the country picked up the story, framing it not just as isolated incident, but as evidence of systemic problems that even police reform advocates like Mayor Williams had failed to adequately address, despite years of policy changes and training programs designed to reduce racial disparities in policing outcomes. Officer Ryan Caldwell had been placed on immediate suspension pending investigation, but the police union had already released statements defending his conduct as reasonable response to suspicious circumstances and claiming that criticism of his actions represented rush to judgment that ignores the challenging realities officers face when making split-second decisions about potential threats. The union's defense was predictably tone-deaf given the video evidence, but it revealed how deeply police culture remained committed to protecting officers regardless of their conduct, how assumptions about black criminality were so normalized within law enforcement that calling a black teenager a thug could be defended as reasonable officer judgment rather than recognized as racist profiling that violated both policy and constitutional requirements for equal treatment. Community organizations that had been demanding police accountability for decades saw James's case as potential turning point. An incident so clear, so well documented, involving a victim so sympathetic and so obviously innocent, that maybe this time the usual patterns of officer protection and minimal consequences might finally be disrupted through sustained public pressure and political will to achieve real transformation. Marcus Jefferson spent the morning coordinating response strategy with Mayor Williams and with the Morrison family's newly retained attorney, a civil rights lawyer named Patricia Chen, who specialized in police misconduct cases and who understood that James's case presented both opportunity for justice and risk of becoming just another example of outrage without accountability if they didn't maintain pressure throughout investigation and discipline processes that typically protected officers through procedural delays and union-negotiated protections. "We need to be strategic about how we use the attention this case is generating," Chen told the group assembled in her office. "Public outrage is high right now, but it will fade as other stories compete for attention. And when it does, the department will try to handle this quietly through internal processes that typically result in minimal discipline, even when misconduct is clear. We need to maintain visibility, keep pressure on the department and the mayor's office to follow through on accountability promises, and use James's case as leverage for systemic reforms rather than just individual discipline that allows the department to claim they've addressed the problem by firing one bad apple while ignoring the culture and training gaps that produced Officer Caldwell in the first place." Mayor Williams absorbed Chen's strategic advice while also processing her own culpability in presiding over a police department that had apparently failed to prevent or detect Officer Caldwell's racist policing, despite her administration's stated commitment to reform and accountability. "Ms. Chen, I want you to know that my commitment to holding Officer Caldwell accountable is genuine and not just performative response to public pressure," Williams said. "I personally witnessed his treatment of James. I've seen the video evidence, and I'm appalled that someone in my police department felt comfortable engaging in such blatant racial profiling. But I also recognize that firing one officer doesn't address the systemic problems that allowed his conduct to go undetected and uncorrected throughout what I assume was years of similar behavior that didn't happen to get witnessed by the mayor and documented on video. I want to use James's case to drive comprehensive reforms, not because his case is more important than others, but because the visibility and the clear evidence create political opportunity to push changes that I haven't been able to achieve through normal policy processes that get watered down through negotiations with the police union and resistance from officers who view accountability as anti-police harassment." The strategy session produced concrete action plan that included immediate steps and long-term reforms designed to prevent future incidents while holding Caldwell accountable for his treatment of James. Immediate actions included comprehensive review of Caldwell's entire career to identify patterns of racist policing that might have been missed or minimized during previous reviews, examination of his field training officers and supervisors to determine whether they failed to recognize or address problematic behavior, audit of body camera and dash cam footage from all his traffic stops to identify other incidents of racial profiling or inappropriate conduct, and criminal referral to prosecutors for potential charges based on deprivation of civil rights under color of law. Long-term reforms included implementation of early intervention system to track officer behavior patterns and trigger supervisory review when disparities emerged, mandatory bias training that went beyond checkbox compliance to include scenario-based exercises revealing unconscious assumptions, creation of civilian review board with real authority to investigate complaints and recommend discipline, revision of use of force policies to emphasize de-escalation, and most ambitiously, pilot program to test alternative response models that sent social workers or mental health professionals rather than armed officers to certain categories of calls that didn't require law enforcement presence. James Morrison had spent a sleepless night processing his trauma and watching his experience become public spectacle discussed by strangers who had opinions about what he should feel or how he should respond or what his case meant for broader conversations about race and policing. His phone had been flooded with messages, supportive comments from classmates and teachers, interview requests from media outlets, encouragement from civil rights activists who saw him as symbol of resilient black youth standing up to racist authority. But James felt overwhelmed rather than empowered by the attention, struggling with the dissonance between people celebrating his courage when he'd simply been trying to survive a terrifying encounter and hadn't chosen to become public face of police reform advocacy. His parents had hired therapists specializing in racial trauma, as Marcus had recommended, and James's first session that morning had focused on processing the immediate shock while establishing framework for longer-term healing that would require months rather than days to achieve anything resembling recovery from an experience that had fundamentally altered his sense of safety and his relationship with American society. I keep replaying it in my head, trying to figure out if there was something I could have done differently to prevent Officer Caldwell from treating me that way, James told Dr. Michelle Warren, the black woman therapist who'd worked with dozens of young people processing similar trauma from police encounters. I know intellectually that I did everything right, that nothing I said or did justified his aggression and contempt. But emotionally, I keep second-guessing every word I spoke, every movement I made, wondering if maybe I sounded too articulate and that's what made him angry, or if I should have been more deferential, or if there was some magic combination of words and tone and body language that would have gotten through his assumptions about who I was and convinced him to treat me like a human being rather than a threat. It's exhausting and I know it's not rational, but I can't stop doing it. Replaying the encounter over and over, trying to solve a puzzle that has no solution because Officer Caldwell had already decided what I was before I'd said anything. Dr. Warren listened with the kind of patient attention that communicated she'd heard variations of this story many times before, and understood that James's self-blame was normal trauma response rather than accurate assessment of his responsibility for Caldwell's racist conduct. James, what you're experiencing is very common after traumatic encounters with police. The hyperanalysis of your own behavior, the belief that if you'd just been perfect enough or said the right thing, you could have prevented the officer's aggression, the exhausting mental replay trying to find the moment where you could have changed the outcome. That's your mind's way of trying to regain sense of control in a situation where you were actually powerless, where nothing you did or said mattered because Officer Caldwell was responding to his assumptions about your skin color rather than to your actual behavior. The work we'll do together is helping you recognize that his racism was his responsibility, not yours, to prevent through perfect compliance or magical communication strategies. You survived an encounter with someone who had power to harm you and who chose to exercise that power in racially discriminatory ways. That's on him, not on you. And healing requires internalizing that truth even when your trauma brain keeps trying to find ways you could have controlled the uncontrollable. The therapy session provided some relief but also exhausting emotional work that left James depleted rather than energized. Understanding that healing would be a long process, requiring sustained effort rather than quick resolution through a few conversations with a skilled professional. When he returned home that afternoon, he found his house surrounded by news crews, seeking interviews, and his phone still flooding with messages that he didn't have energy to read or respond to, making him feel trapped in his own home by attention he'd never sought. And that felt more burdensome than empowering, despite well-meaning people's insistence that his story was important and inspirational. His mother, Angela, recognized her son's overwhelm and enforced strict boundaries. No media interviews until James felt ready, limited social media engagement to protect his mental health, focus on school and normal teenage activities rather than becoming consumed by advocacy work that adults should be doing, rather than placing that burden on a traumatized 17-year-old. The internal affairs investigation of Officer Ryan Caldwell was progressing with unusual speed and thoroughness, given Mayor Williams's personal involvement and her stated intention to ensure accountability that went beyond the minimal discipline that typically resulted from investigations of police misconduct. The review of Caldwell's career revealed patterns that were simultaneously shocking in their clarity and depressingly unsurprising to anyone familiar with how racist policing operated. Black drivers were stopped by Caldwell at rates 3 times higher than their representation in the neighborhoods he patrolled. Traffic stops of black drivers lasted an average of 12 minutes longer than stops of white drivers, even when controlling for violation type and whether citations were issued. Searches were conducted on black drivers at rates 5 times higher than white drivers, despite white drivers being slightly more likely to actually have contraband when searched. Use of force reports showed Caldwell employed physical control techniques against black suspects at dramatically higher rates than against white suspects in comparable situations. The pattern was so clear, so consistent across years of data, that defending it as anything other than systematic racial discrimination required willful blindness or deliberate dishonesty about what the numbers revealed. How did this pattern go undetected for Caldwell's entire 8-year career? Mayor Williams demanded during meeting with Police Chief Raymond Foster, her fury at the systemic failures evident in every word. We have all this data, we generate reports, we supposedly monitor officer performance, and yet Caldwell was allowed to engage in blatant racial profiling for years without any intervention or discipline until he happened to profile my senior policy advisor's godson right in front of me? That suggests our accountability systems are completely inadequate, that we're not actually looking for discriminatory patterns, or we're looking but not caring when we find them. Because individual incidents can always be explained away through contextual factors that supposedly justify the disparities. This is on me as much as it's on Caldwell or his supervisors. I've been in office for 3 years promising police reform, and clearly those reforms haven't penetrated to the level where they actually change officer behavior or trigger intervention when patterns like Caldwell's emerge. That ends now. I want comprehensive review of every officer's stop data, search data, use of force data, with particular attention to racial disparities. I want supervisors held accountable for failing to recognize or address problematic patterns among officers they're responsible for overseeing. And I want real consequences for officers whose data shows clear discrimination, not just additional training that allows them to continue policing while we pretend the problem has been addressed. Chief Foster absorbed the mayor's anger while defending systems and supervisors who had apparently failed to prevent or detect Caldwell's racist policing throughout his career. Mayor Williams, I share your concern about Officer Caldwell's pattern of discriminatory conduct, and I want to assure you that we're taking this investigation extremely seriously and that appropriate discipline will be imposed based on our findings. But I also need you to understand the challenges of identifying problematic patterns in real time when officers are making hundreds of decisions daily and when each individual decision can be defended through contextual factors about specific circumstances. Caldwell's stops of black drivers might have seemed reasonable when viewed individually. High crime area, late night hours, vehicle matching description from recent crime, evasive behavior during the stop. But when we aggregate the data and look at patterns over time, the disparities become undeniable in ways they weren't obvious to supervisors reviewing individual incidents. We need better systems for monitoring patterns, I completely agree, but I also want to make clear that supervisors weren't deliberately ignoring racism. They genuinely didn't see the forest through the trees because our reporting systems and review processes weren't designed to surface these kinds of systemic patterns in ways that triggered intervention before incidents reached crisis levels. The explanation was honest about systemic failures, while also revealing how police leadership continued to prioritize protecting officers and supervisors over acknowledging that genuine failure to see racism that was obvious in aggregated data represented its own form of negligence that required accountability rather than understanding. Mayor Williams wasn't satisfied with explanations that framed the problem as systems failure rather than culture failure, understanding that systems reflected the priorities and values of the people who designed and implemented them. Chief Foster, I appreciate your honesty about our monitoring gaps, but I'm not willing to accept that supervisors who reviewed Caldwell's individual stops and somehow never noticed that he was stopping and searching black drivers at dramatically disproportionate rates. I'm not willing to accept that as innocent oversight rather than as evidence that they weren't looking for racial disparities because they didn't view them as problems requiring attention. The culture of this department apparently treats racial profiling as acceptable policing as long as individual incidents can be rationalized through post hoc explanations about officer safety or high crime areas. That culture needs to change fundamentally, and changing it requires consequences for everyone who enabled Caldwell's racist policing through active misconduct or through passive failure to recognize and address obvious patterns. I want recommendations within 2 weeks for discipline, not just for Caldwell, but for his supervisors who failed to do their jobs. And I want your proposal for systemic reforms that will make it impossible for another Officer Caldwell to operate for years without detection or intervention. 3 months after James Morrison's traumatic traffic stop catalyzed intense scrutiny of police practices and precipitated reforms that were simultaneously more comprehensive than previous efforts and still insufficient to address decades of accumulated mistrust between law enforcement and black communities. The outcomes of various investigations and discipline processes were finally becoming clear in ways that revealed both progress and persistent challenges. Officer Ryan Caldwell had been fired from the police department after internal affairs investigation sustained multiple charges of misconduct, including racial profiling, false detention, intimidation of a minor, and conduct unbecoming an officer. The police union had filed grievance challenging the termination as disproportionate discipline, but the arbitrator had upheld the firing after reviewing the extensive evidence of Caldwell's pattern of discriminatory policing throughout his career, determining that the department had just cause for termination and that Caldwell's conduct had been so egregious and so clearly established through multiple forms of evidence that union protections couldn't shield him from consequences. The arbitrator's decision was significant victory for accountability, though it was also immediately appealed through additional legal channels that would drag out final resolution for potentially years while Caldwell sought reinstatement and back pay through courts that were often sympathetic to police grievances, even when misconduct was clear and well documented. Criminal charges had also been filed against Caldwell by state prosecutors who'd been pressured by community activists and by Mayor Williams's public statements supporting prosecution for civil rights violations that went beyond employment misconduct to constitute criminal deprivation of rights under color of law. Caldwell faced charges including false imprisonment, official oppression, and civil rights violations, though legal experts cautioned that convictions would be difficult to obtain given that juries were often reluctant to criminalize police conduct even when it clearly crossed legal and constitutional lines. The trial was scheduled for 6 months out, giving James Morrison time to continue healing, while also requiring him to prepare for testimony that would force him to relive his trauma in public courtroom setting, where defense attorneys would attempt to impeach his credibility and suggest that maybe he'd contributed to the encounter through attitude or behavior that justified Caldwell's response. The prospect of testifying was anxiety-inducing for James, who'd made significant progress in therapy, but who still struggled with hypervigilance when driving and with trust issues regarding authority figures who might view him as threat despite his obvious innocence and respectability. The systemic reforms that Mayor Williams had promised in the immediate aftermath of James's traffic stop were being implemented with varying degrees of success and resistance from police culture that viewed accountability measures as attacks on officer autonomy rather than recognizing them as necessary oversight to ensure constitutional policing and equal treatment. The early intervention system tracking officer behavior patterns for racial disparities had identified 38 officers whose stop rates, search patterns, or use of force showed statistically significant differences in how they treated citizens of different races. 22 of those officers had completed enhanced training and demonstrated subsequent improvement in their patterns, while 16 remained under enhanced supervision or had been reassigned to non-patrol duties pending decisions about their continued employment. The data-driven approach was generating backlash from officers who complained they were being punished for doing their jobs in high-crime areas that happened to be predominantly non-white, refusing to acknowledge that disparate treatment of citizens in those areas based on race rather than behavior constituted the discrimination that accountability systems were designed to detect and correct. James Morrison had returned to school and to debate team with determination to maintain normalcy despite the trauma and despite becoming somewhat famous locally as face of police reform advocacy that he'd never sought to become. His classmates treated him with mixture of sympathy and awkwardness, not quite knowing how to interact with someone who'd experienced such public trauma and whose case had become national news story about racism and policing. Some white students seem to view James differently now, not as their accomplished peer, but as representative of black grievance or as someone whose experience indicted them personally for racism they claimed not to harbor. James found these interactions exhausting, navigating the emotional labor of managing white discomfort while processing his own ongoing trauma and trying to focus on college applications and debate competitions that suddenly felt less important than they had before. Officer Caldwell had reminded him that achievement offered no reliable protection against racist assumptions about who he was and what he represented. His debate partner, Rachel Chen, had been consistently supportive, following his lead about when he wanted to discuss what had happened, and when he needed to focus on tournament preparation or normal teenage concerns about colleges and relationships, and the everyday anxieties that didn't disappear just because you'd survived police encounter that could have ended much worse. James, I've been reading about the reforms Mayor Williams is implementing, and I keep wondering if they're actually going to make a difference or if this is just going to be another cycle of promises and policy changes that don't translate into changed behavior from officers who resist accountability, Rachel said during practice session where they were supposed to be preparing arguments about criminal justice reform, a topic that had taken on very different meaning for James. After experiencing firsthand the racism that made reform necessary, I want to believe that your case is going to produce lasting change, that Officer Caldwell's firing and potential prosecution will deter other officers from similar conduct. But my mom works in civil rights law, and she's told me stories about previous high-profile cases that generated temporary outrage, but didn't prevent the next incident or the one after that, because the underlying culture and assumptions that produce racist policing are so deeply embedded that they resist reform efforts even when political leaders are genuinely committed to change. I'm not trying to be pessimistic. I'm just worried that you went through this trauma and it's going to turn out to have been for nothing if the reforms don't stick or if they get watered down once media attention fades and the political pressure decreases. James appreciated Rachel's honest concern, even as it articulated fears he shared but tried not to dwell on, because accepting that his trauma might produce no lasting change felt unbearably depressing. I think about that too. Whether my case will actually matter beyond Officer Caldwell losing his job, whether the reforms will survive once I'm no longer in headlines and once Mayor Williams faces pressure from police unions pushing back against accountability measures they view as harassment. Uncle Marcus tells me that sustained change requires sustained pressure, that reforms only stick when community maintains vigilance and demands follow-through rather than accepting promises as sufficient. He's been working with community organizations to create monitoring systems that will track whether the reforms actually produce changed outcomes or whether they're just performative gestures that allow the department to claim they've addressed problems while actual patterns of discriminatory policing continue unchanged. I want to be involved in that monitoring work, to use my platform and my case to keep pressure on the department. But I also need to balance advocacy with taking care of myself and focusing on my own life and future. It's hard to figure out where those boundaries should be, how much I owe to the cause versus how much I need to protect my own mental health, and not let this incident define my entire identity or consume all my energy. Marcus Jefferson had indeed been working intensively with community organizations to ensure that James's case produced lasting transformation rather than temporary adjustments that would revert to previous patterns once scrutiny decreased. The Civilian Review Board that Mayor Williams had established as part of her reform package had become focal point for accountability advocacy, with community members serving on the board demanding access to data and authority to review officer conduct in ways that went beyond the advisory roles that typically characterized civilian oversight bodies with impressive titles but minimal actual power. Martha Washington, a longtime civil rights activist who chaired the review board, had developed effective working relationship with Marcus, built on shared commitment to transparency and real accountability, even when it was politically uncomfortable or generated resistance from police unions and officers who viewed civilian oversight as illegitimate interference with law enforcement professionals. Mr. Jefferson, I want to thank you for your advocacy in getting this review board established with actual authority rather than just symbolic presence that allows city to claim civilian oversight without giving us power to actually hold anyone accountable, Washington said during their monthly meeting to review discipline cases and policy implementation. But I also need to be honest that we're facing significant resistance from the department and from officers who view our involvement as attack on their professional autonomy. We've reviewed 18 cases in the past 3 months where we believe discipline was insufficient given the severity of misconduct, and in 14 of those cases our recommendations for enhanced discipline were either ignored or significantly modified by the police chief who has final authority over personnel decisions. That's frustrating, and it suggests that civilian oversight remains largely performative unless we can find ways to make our recommendations binding rather than advisory. Marcus understood Washington's frustration, having anticipated that implementing reforms would face resistance from police culture that viewed accountability as threat, rather than recognizing it as necessary component of legitimate law enforcement. Martha, you're right that advisory authority is insufficient when recommendations get ignored, and we need to push Mayor Williams to give the review board binding authority over discipline decisions. But we also need to be strategic about how we frame that demand. If we come across as trying to strip the police chief of all personnel authority, we'll generate backlash that makes it easier for opponents to paint civilian oversight as anti-police rather than pro-accountability. Maybe we focus on binding authority for specific categories of serious misconduct, racial profiling, excessive force, false arrest, where community voice should be determinative rather than just advisory. That gives the board real power in cases that matter most to community trust, while allowing chief to retain authority over routine personnel decisions that don't involve constitutional violations or discriminatory conduct. It's compromise, I know, but sometimes achieving real progress requires accepting incremental gains rather than holding out for perfect solutions that political realities make impossible to achieve. The conversation between Marcus and Washington reflected ongoing tension in police reform efforts between accepting incremental progress that could be achieved through negotiation and compromise versus demanding comprehensive transformation that addressed root causes, but that faced such intense resistance that implementation often proved impossible or got so watered down through political process that final results bore little resemblance to original vision. James Morrison's case had created political opportunity to push more aggressive reforms than had been possible before he became public face of police racism. But translating that temporary attention into lasting institutional change required navigating complex political dynamics that balanced demands for justice against practical realities of what could be implemented given union contracts, legal constraints, and cultural resistance from officers who viewed reforms as attacks rather than improvements. Marcus walked this tightrope daily in his role as senior policy advisor, trying to advance transformative change while remaining politically viable and maintaining relationships with stakeholders whose support was necessary for any reforms to survive beyond initial implementation. James Morrison's testimony at the community forum 6 months after his traffic stop was powerful and emotionally raw, describing not just what Officer Caldwell had done, but how the experience had fundamentally altered his sense of safety and his relationship with American society that he'd believed would reward his achievements and protect his rights, but that had proven itself willing to treat him as criminal based solely on his skin color, regardless of his obvious innocence and respectability. I want people to understand that what Officer Caldwell did to me wasn't just about one bad cop having a bad night, James told the packed community center, his voice steady despite the tears he didn't try to hide. It was about a system that taught him to see me as a threat before I'd done anything, that gave him permission to call me a thug before asking my name, that protected him throughout his career while he engaged in the same discriminatory policing against countless other black people who didn't have a godfather connected to the mayor to intervene and demand accountability. I had every advantage. Private school education, debate championships, college acceptance letters, articulate speech, cooperative behavior, and none of it mattered because Officer Caldwell had already decided what I was based on my skin color. If I wasn't safe from that kind of racism despite all my advantages, then what hope do other black teenagers have when they encounter officers who view them with the same assumptions and hostility? That's what keeps me up at night. Not just what happened to me, but knowing that it's still happening to others who don't have my platform or my protection, whose cases never generate outrage or accountability because they don't have the right connections, or because their trauma happens in neighborhoods where people have learned that complaining about police misconduct produces retaliation rather than reform. The audience's response to James's testimony was overwhelming. Standing ovation that lasted several minutes, people openly weeping at his articulation of trauma and injustice, community members approaching afterward to share their own stories of racist policing and to thank him for using his platform to demand changes that benefited everyone rather than just seeking personal justice. But James also felt exhausted by the emotional labor of performing his trauma for public consumption, of being expected to educate and inspire when what he really wanted was to just be a normal 17-year-old worrying about college essays and prom dates, rather than serving as symbol of police racism and voice for reform movements that existed long before his case and would continue long after media attention moved on. His therapist, Dr. Warren, had warned him about this dynamic. How trauma survivors, especially those from marginalized communities, were often expected to transform their pain into activism that served broader causes, with their worth measured by their willingness to be inspirational rather than by their success in healing and reclaiming lives that racism had interrupted. Mayor Catherine Williams had used James's case and the sustained community pressure it generated to push for reforms more comprehensive than what she'd been able to achieve in her first 3 years as mayor, when police unions and officer resistance had blocked or watered down most of her accountability proposals. The new policies implemented in the 6 months since James's traffic stop included mandatory body camera activation for all traffic stops with severe discipline for officers who failed to record interactions, data collection requirements tracking demographic information about every stop to enable pattern analysis, revised use of force continuum emphasizing de-escalation with specific training on implicit bias and its impact on threat perception. Community input into police academy curriculum to ensure training reflected values of communities being policed rather than just law enforcement priorities. And perhaps most significantly, removal of qualified immunity protections for officers who engaged in clearly established constitutional violations, including racial profiling. The qualified immunity reform was particularly controversial, generating fierce opposition from police unions who claimed it would make officers vulnerable to frivolous lawsuits and would discourage proactive policing for fear of legal liability, though civil rights advocates pointed out that accountability for constitutional violations shouldn't be considered controversial or burdensome if officers were actually committed to lawful conduct. Officer Ryan Caldwell's criminal trial was scheduled to begin in 2 weeks, and James was preparing for testimony that would require him to face his abuser in courtroom setting, while defense attorneys attempted to suggest that maybe his articulate speech had been perceived as threatening by Officer Caldwell, maybe his movements had justified suspicion, maybe the entire encounter had been reasonable police work that only looked bad when viewed through lens of racial grievance and political correctness. The defense strategy was predictable but still enraging, taking James's strengths and advantages and attempting to transform them into evidence that he'd somehow provoked or contributed to Caldwell's racist aggression, suggesting that being well-spoken, while black, was itself suspicious because it indicated someone trying to deceive or manipulate rather than just being an educated teenager doing nothing wrong. Patricia Chen, the Morrison family's attorney, had prepared James extensively for the defense tactics he would face, role-playing hostile cross-examination and teaching him how to maintain composure while being asked questions designed to make him doubt himself or to trap him into statements that could be twisted to support defense narratives about Caldwell's conduct being reasonable under circumstances. James, I want you to remember that the defense attorney's job is to create reasonable doubt about whether Officer Caldwell's conduct was criminal, which means he's going to try to make you seem less sympathetic, or to suggest you contributed to the escalation, Chen explained during their preparation session. He might ask why you didn't just comply immediately without asking questions, suggesting that your request to know why you'd been stopped was confrontational rather than reasonable assertion of your rights. He might focus on your debate team training and suggest you were being argumentative or using vocabulary designed to make Officer Caldwell feel inferior. He might ask whether you were nervous during the stop in ways that could have been interpreted as suspicious, rather than recognizing your nervousness as completely reasonable response to being treated like a criminal by someone with power to hurt you. All of these tactics are designed to shift focus from Caldwell's racism to your behavior, to make it seem like maybe you deserved what happened or at least that Caldwell's response was understandable given how you acted. Your job is to stay calm, answer questions honestly, but without accepting the framing that suggests you did anything wrong, and remind the jury through your demeanor that you were a scared 17-year-old trying to survive an encounter with an aggressive officer who'd already decided you were a criminal before you'd spoken a word. The trial preparation was grueling and triggering, forcing James to relive his trauma repeatedly while learning to describe it in language that would resonate with jurors who might share some of Officer Caldwell's assumptions about black teenagers, or who might be inclined to give police benefit of doubt even when evidence of misconduct was clear. Marcus Jefferson attended several of the preparation sessions, offering support and advice based on his own experience, testifying in cases where his professional credibility and his emotional composure were both constantly tested and evaluated. James, the hardest part of testifying is maintaining your humanity while also performing the kind of respectability that makes jurors willing to see you as victim worthy of protection rather than as threat who got what you deserved, Marcus told his godson during a break in the preparation sessions. You have to be articulate enough to be taken seriously, but not so articulate that you seem threatening or uppity. You have to show emotion to demonstrate the trauma you experienced, but not so much emotion that you seem unstable or unreliable. You have to assert your rights while also showing deference to authority so you don't seem like you were challenging Officer Caldwell inappropriately. It's exhausting and unfair that you have to perform this tightrope walk just to be believed about your own experience. But that's the reality of testifying as a black person against a white police officer in a system that's designed to protect police even when they abuse their authority. The day of James Morrison's testimony arrived with crushing weight of expectation and anxiety that made it difficult to eat breakfast or to focus on anything beyond the ordeal ahead. His parents accompanied him to the courthouse along with Marcus and Mayor Williams, their presence providing some comfort, but unable to fully shield him from the vulnerability of having to describe his worst moment to strangers who would evaluate his credibility and his worthiness of protection based on factors that had nothing to do with objective truth and everything to do with their own biases and assumptions about race and police authority. The courtroom was packed with media representatives, community activists, police union members there to support Caldwell, and citizens invested in the outcome for various reasons, ranging from genuine concern about justice to political interest in how the case might affect broader debates about police reform. James took the witness stand feeling simultaneously exposed and determined. Exposed because his trauma was about to become public performance scrutinized by people with agendas and judgments. Determined because he understood that his testimony mattered not just for achieving accountability in his own case, but for demonstrating to other young black people that speaking truth about police racism could produce consequences even in systems designed to protect officers from accountability. His direct examination by the prosecutor went smoothly, James describing the traffic stop in methodical detail that made Officer Caldwell's racism undeniable to anyone listening with open mind and willingness to believe a black teenager's account of being racially profiled. He explained how he'd been driving carefully within all traffic laws, how Caldwell had approached with immediate aggression and contempt, how he'd been called a thug before being asked a single question, how his attempts at respectful compliance had been met with mockery and escalating hostility, how he'd felt terrified that any movement or word might trigger violence that would end his life or irreparably harm his future. The prosecutor played the video footage from Mayor Williams's phone, the images of James with his hands raised and tears streaming down his face while Caldwell stood over him with visible contempt, providing powerful corroboration of his testimony that the defense would struggle to impeach or explain away. When the prosecutor finished her direct examination and turned James over to the defense attorney for cross-examination, he took a deep breath and prepared himself for the attack he knew was coming, the attempt to transform his trauma into evidence of his own culpability or to suggest that maybe Officer Caldwell's racism had been reasonable police work misunderstood by people who didn't appreciate the challenges of law enforcement. "Mr. Morrison, you're quite articulate, aren't you?" Defense attorney Robert Mitchell began, his tone suggesting James's articulate speech was somehow suspicious or problematic, rather than simply evidence of good education and careful preparation. "You're on the debate team at your private school. You've won championships. You're heading to Yale University on a full scholarship. You're clearly intelligent and well-spoken, someone who knows how to use language persuasively. Isn't it possible that Officer Caldwell perceived your articulate responses during the traffic stop as evasive or as an attempt to manipulate him rather than as straightforward compliance? Isn't it possible that your debate training made you come across as argumentative or confrontational in ways that would cause a reasonable officer to become concerned about the interaction?" The question revealed the defense strategy clearly, taking James's achievements and advantages and attempting to transform them into evidence that he'd somehow provoked Caldwell's racism through the crime of being educated while black, suggesting that officers were justified in viewing articulate speech from black teenagers as suspicious rather than recognizing it as what it actually was. Desperate attempt to survive encounters with authority figures who'd already decided they were threats. James felt anger surge at the question's implications, but he maintained the calm composure that Patricia Chen had drilled into him during preparation sessions, understanding that showing anger would be used as evidence of the hostility that defense was trying to suggest had justified Caldwell's treatment. "Sir, I was respectful and cooperative throughout my interaction with Officer Caldwell," James responded carefully. "I used clear language because I wanted to make sure there was no confusion about my compliance with his instructions or about my rights as a citizen during a traffic stop. My debate training taught me to communicate effectively, not to be argumentative or confrontational. If Officer Caldwell perceived respectful compliance and clear communication as threatening, that says something about his assumptions about who I am and what I represent based on my appearance, not about my actual behavior or my intent during the encounter. I was a scared 17-year-old trying not to get hurt or arrested for doing nothing wrong, and I used every tool I had, including careful speech and announced movements and visible deference, to survive an encounter that felt dangerous from the moment Officer Caldwell approached my vehicle with aggression and contempt rather than professional courtesy. The response was perfect. Acknowledging the question while reframing it to highlight Caldwell's racism, rather than accepting the suggestion that James's articulate speech had been problematic, demonstrating through his measured delivery exactly the kind of respectful communication that should have de-escalated the traffic stop rather than triggering greater hostility. Defense attorney Mitchell tried several more angles, suggesting James had been nervous in ways that justified suspicion, implying that driving in that particular neighborhood at that particular time might have been legitimately suspicious regardless of race, asking whether James had been completely truthful in his initial responses to Caldwell's questions. But each attempt to impeach James's credibility or to suggest he'd contributed to the encounter failed to land effectively because the video, evidence, and James's consistent calm testimony made clear that Caldwell's racism had driven the interaction from beginning to end rather than being reasonable response to suspicious behavior. After 45 minutes of cross-examination that felt like hours to James, the defense attorney finally released him from the witness stand, and James returned to his seat beside his parents feeling exhausted and shaky, but also proud that he'd maintained his composure and told his truth clearly despite the defense's attempts to discredit him or twist his words into something they weren't. The trial concluded 2 weeks later with guilty verdict on all charges: false imprisonment, official oppression, and civil rights violations, making Officer Ryan Caldwell one of the rare police officers to face criminal conviction for racist policing rather than being protected through qualified immunity and sympathetic juries unwilling to hold police accountable even when misconduct was clear. The verdict was significant victory for accountability, generating celebration among civil rights advocates who'd fought for decades to see officers face real consequences for racist violence, rather than just departmental discipline that could be appealed or overturned through union grievance processes. But the celebration was tempered by recognition that one conviction didn't dismantle systems that produced officers like Caldwell daily, that the reforms implemented after James's case would face ongoing resistance and might not survive changes in political leadership, and that countless other black youth would continue experiencing racist policing in encounters that didn't happen to be witnessed by mayors or documented on video or generate the kind of sustained attention that made accountability possible in James's case, despite normal patterns of police protection. James Morrison stood on the courthouse steps after the verdict was announced, surrounded by his family and by community members who'd supported him throughout the ordeal, and gave a brief statement to assembled media that captured both his relief at accountability achieved and his understanding that the work of transformation extended far beyond any individual case or conviction. "I'm grateful that Officer Caldwell has been held accountable for what he did to me and for the pattern of racist policing he engaged in throughout his career," James said, his voice steady and mature beyond his 17 years. "But I also know that convicting one officer doesn't solve the systemic problems that produced him, that made him confident he could treat me with contempt and racism without facing consequences, that allowed his supervisors to ignore obvious patterns of discriminatory conduct for years without intervention. Real justice requires more than individual accountability. It requires transforming police culture and training and oversight to make racist policing impossible rather than just occasionally punished when cases become too public to ignore. I hope my experience and Officer Caldwell's conviction will inspire continued pressure for reforms that protect all black youth, not just those fortunate enough to have godfathers connected to political power or to be in the right place when the mayor happened to be driving by. Every black teenager deserves to drive home from school without fear of being called a thug by officers who view their skin color as reasonable suspicion. That's the world we need to build, and building it requires sustained effort long after media attention fades and long after my case stops being headline news. The statement was met with applause and with renewed commitment from activists to maintain pressure for reforms even as public attention began shifting to other stories and other crises that competed for limited space in news cycles and political consciousness. Marcus Jefferson stood beside his godson, feeling pride in James's growth and maturity, but also carrying grief for the innocence and trust that had been stolen by Officer Caldwell's racism, understanding that James would never fully recover the sense of safety and optimism that he'd carried before learning viscerally that achievement offered no reliable protection against assumptions about black criminality. The work ahead was extensive, monitoring implementation of reforms to ensure they produced actual changes in police behavior rather than just policy documents that looked impressive but didn't translate into different outcomes. Maintaining community pressure when political will inevitably waned and police unions pushed back against accountability measures they'd never supported. Preparing for the likelihood that despite all the attention and all the reforms James's case had generated, similar incidents would continue occurring until fundamental transformation of police culture made racist policing professionally and legally untenable rather than just occasionally embarrassing when cases became too public to manage quietly. As James Morrison returned to the routine of being a high school senior preparing for graduation and college, carrying trauma that therapy was helping him process, but that would shape his worldview and his relationship with authority for the rest of his life. He understood with painful clarity that his experience represented both exceptional attention, given his family's connections, and also completely ordinary reality that black teenagers navigated constantly without protection or recourse. He'd been lucky that Marcus and Mayor Williams had arrived when they did, lucky that his godfather had resources and relationships to demand accountability, lucky that video evidence had captured Caldwell's racism undeniably, lucky that sustained community pressure had prevented the usual patterns of officer protection from shielding Caldwell from consequences. But luck shouldn't be required for justice, and the fact that it was revealed how fundamentally broken the systems remained, despite centuries of promises and decades of reforms that never quite achieved the transformation that would make Black lives matter as much in practice as they supposedly did in principle. James carried that knowledge with him as he prepared to leave for Yale in the fall, determined to use his education and his platform to continue pushing for changes that his generation would hopefully complete after his parents' and grandparents' generations had made progress but hadn't finished the work of making America actually live up to its stated ideals of equal justice and equal protection under law. James's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. If a straight-A student heading to Yale on scholarship isn't safe from being called a thug by police, then credentials and achievements offer no real protection against racist assumptions. Have you or someone you love ever been in a situation where your accomplishments and respectability meant nothing because someone in authority had already decided who you were based on how you looked? How did you navigate that moment? And what did it teach you about the gap between the America we're promised and the America that actually exists? Share your reflections in the comments below. Your story matters, and sometimes just naming these experiences helps us realize we're not alone in carrying this weight. If James's journey moved you, please subscribe and help us build a community that believes real accountability requires more than individual consequences, that police reform must be sustained through generations, not just news cycles, and that every teenager deserves to drive home from school without fear of being terrorized by people sworn to protect them. What conversations do we need next? What stories help us imagine the transformation we're fighting for? Thank you for being here and for refusing to accept that this is just how things have to be.